Hi, listeners. Stories have so much power, and so does whoever controls the narrative. It is time that we dissect and analyze these stories. I am Vipul, and this is WokeTales. Happy Pride Month, everyone. Today's episode is a love story, but a tragic one which succumbed to the societal pressure and influence. To dissect and analyze this story, I have my in-house legal counsel, Dylan Blumenthal. Hi, Dylan. Welcome to WokeTales.
Hi, Vipul. Thanks for having me. And just to let everyone out there know, I'm not a licensed attorney.
Yet.
Yeah.
Yes, I think I have more legal knowledge than he does because I have so many hours of watching Judge Judy under my belt.
Right.
Okay, so are you excited to listen to the love story I've picked for you?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear it. So
It's story time. When it came to romance, Andersen was more moth than flame. Andersen frequently flirted with men and women alike, and just as often, he found himself burned by rejection. Edward, in particular, was the candle he danced around. Even when staying too near singed his wings. At first, Edward was standoffish, unimpressed by the peculiar boy his father had brought into their home. But once Edward began helping Andersen with his Latin and grammar, they soon became close. In Edward's mind as friends, and as would-be lovers in Andersen's. I long for you as though you were a beautiful Calabrian girl, Andersen pined in one letter. Then, switching the gender of this dynamic, he wrote yearningly to Edward that my sentiments for you are those of a woman. In another, he confessed to Edward that during one summer he had brought a provincial rose up to his bed, kissed it religiously, and then placed it under his pillow. In a particular extraordinary composition, Andersen wrote Edward a poem about the rose. Rosebud so firm and round, lovely as a young girl's mouth, I kiss you as my bride. The poem continues with further kisses and an exhortation to, quote, feel my fire, quote. Though Edward showed no obvious reciprocation of Andersen's heated advances. If anything, he was naively flummoxed by it at first, but Andersen seemed determined to keep trying, happy to keep flying near his beloved, and hoping he would not burn and fall, but would instead convince Edward to love him in turn. Andersen sent him stories. Once, Edward responded with an indignant letter bewailing that you write too much and have deplorable productivity, which nearly broke Andersen. But, as in many unhealthy relationships, Andersen kept at it. If he was overly aggressive in his advances, it was a desperation perhaps at least partly born out of immense pressure and pain of his day to repress his queerness. Then Edward announced his plan to get married to a woman. Andersen was devastated, but he kept smilingly inserting himself, even sending letter to Edward's fiancée, Henriette. Soon his facade crumbled, and he appeared to be trying to stop the marriage from happening altogether. I found myself unable to respond to this love, and this caused Andersen much suffering, Edward acknowledged, even as his own letters at the time often simply expressed or feigned ignorance to Andersen's lust. When Edward, in a less angered moment, defined Andersen as a worthy friend in a letter in the year of his wedding, Andersen finally seemed to snap. From the island of Finn, where he had retreated, he wrote a sharp, subtly erotic rebuke to his unavailable crush. Why do you call me your worthy friend? I don't want to be worthy. This is the most insipid, boring word you could use. Any fool can be called worthy. I have hotter blood than you and half of Copenhagen. Edward, I feel so infuriated by this loathsome weather. I also long for you, to shake you, to see your hysterical laughter, to be able to walk away, insulted, and not come back to you for 2 whole days. Andersen wanted to be desired, loved, and a simple label of worthy friend was an insult, a denial, and that was the tragic end of Andersen's love. hurt by Edward's seeming betrayal, Andersen turned to where he always did, his stories. He imagined a world deep beneath the sea, where a mermaid, seeking someone from another world, a human prince, finds herself rejected by him, even after she saves his life, and later, desiring that he see her as beautiful, convinces a sea witch to give her legs. The mermaid swaps her beautiful voice and tongue for some legs. Although she was able to walk on land, every step she takes resembles being pricked by sharp knives. However, instead of falling for the mermaid, the prince marries another woman. Unlike Walt Disney's later, softer adaptation of The Little Mermaid, Andersen wrote an ending filled with pathos where his mermaid, left alone and unloved, dies and dissolves into sea foam.
Wow. You really got me with that one, Bickle. I knew about, most of the story up until that point. And then you just kind of threw this twist in. And also, I didn't realize that's how the original Little Mermaid ended.
Yeah, so I think, there are two things here that the initial story, the love story between Andersen and Edward, is the real story of Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote The Little Mermaid. And yes, that's the ending of the original story. But obviously, Disney had to make it a little bit more softer.
Of course.
So, I know it was a tragic and an intense story, but Dylan, before we quote-unquote dive in their analysis, what are your initial thoughts about the story, and how do you feel about the revelation of the Little Mermaid in the end?
Well, I was definitely not expecting that ending. But at first, I was really annoyed by Andersen. He comes off as quite overbearing. I thought to myself, come on, Andersen, you have to realize that Edward got the message. So if he tells you that you write too much, then respect his wishes and stop. But thinking more about this story, there are so many heartbreaking instances of queer men who suppress their own truths in order to conform to societal norms and expectations. We don't really know what's going on in Edward's mind. For all we know, it could be the case here that Edward might actually have feelings for Andersen, and that Edward is shutting down Andersen's expression of his love so that it is easier for Edward himself to shut down or suppress his feelings toward Andersen. Maybe he's thinking to himself, if I can get Andersen to stop by pretending like I don't know what he's talking about, Andersen will eventually stop, and then my own feelings for him will go away. The point is that we don't know what's going through Edward's mind. If we could round up all of the formerly or currently closeted queer men and tell them this story, I think they would unanimously agree with me that it is entirely possible that Edward is in the closet trying to fight his feelings.
Hi, Vera. Seems like Vera agrees with you. Maybe Edward hasn't realized his feelings, therefore hasn't come to terms with it, and it could be the societal influence that a relationship between a man and a woman is all that he knows. Or probably he wants to conform to the societal norm and expectations from him. But it also could be that Edward was just being polite and didn't know how to stop Andersen's advances. It is just so nuanced whenever feelings come into picture, especially of anyone who is not in a heterosexual cis-gendered relationship. The societal influence can make experience of anyone who is not in the dominant culture more difficult even now. And this was in 1800s, when Edward and Andersen probably didn't have examples to see themselves in if they were to pursue a relationship. So there is a strong possibility that Edward is questioning or coming to terms with his feelings, because if he cannot admit those to himself, it would be almost impossible for him to be able to verbalize it to anybody else.
While I don't want to suggest that Edward owes Andersen anything, Edward could have at least shut down Andersen instead of repeatedly feigning ignorance, telling Andersen he has deplorable productivity, and ultimately skirting the issue. And I think this skirting of the issue by Edward says a lot. Often, when presented with a set of facts, there's just as much information in what isn't said as there is in what is explicitly stated. So if Edward didn't want to hear from Andersen, he could tell him straight up to quit sending him letters. Edward could have told Andersen he wasn't interested. There's a lot Edward could have told his worthy friend regarding his lack of feelings, but he didn't. Maybe Edward's announcement of his engagement could be construed as a message to Andersen to quit. The fact that despite all of this, Edvard continues to feign ignorance is a telltale sign, at least in my mind, that Edvard does have some feelings for Andersen, even if they aren't quite as impassioned as Andersen's.
Some might say that Andersen was being overly aggressive in his advances, but isn't that because he doesn't have an outlet for those emotions? The society obviously wasn't accepting at that time, and probably not completely accepting today as well. But even though queerness has always been present, it was a desperation born out of the immense pressure and pain to repress his queerness that Andersen, his feelings were so aggressive or overbearing, like you said. And because probably since he never got a direct no from Edvard, he thought that he could be himself with Edvard.
Yeah, I agree that Andersen's writing and his letters to Edvard were his outlet. They were the only way really for him to express his feelings and kind of get his feelings off of his chest, so to speak. And I also think it's interesting, going back to what you said about maybe Edvard, just all he knew was that a relationship is between a man and a woman. You said, or maybe he just wants to conform to societal norms. And I feel like that's more likely, that he's just trying to conform. Because, you know, at the beginning of the story, Andersen does compare his feelings to those which he might exhibit toward women.
And going back to being aggressive in expression of the feelings, we see such a polarized stance in this relationship, with one being quite aggressive and the other repressing his feelings. And drawing parallel to this story, even now queer men get a reputation of being aggressive about expression of their sexuality.
Yeah, I do agree that there is this kind of stereotype of gay men being sexually aggressive, but I would also suggest that men in general have a stereotype of being, you know, sexually aggressive, and I think maybe gay men get more of that bad rap because the identity of being a gay man is entwined with the idea of sex. So I think it's easier for society to stereotype gay men in this way because of the nature of their identities.
And what do you think about the influence that society could have? Because, as you see, Andersen took his real-life story and made it into a fairy tale, which we all now know as The Little Mermaid. But in The Little Mermaid, he has shown the love story which is more accepted by society, even though it is between two different species. But just because they are between a man and a woman, it is more societally accepted and praised, probably. So do you have any thoughts about the influence society plays in how one expresses and presents their love?
Well, since you mentioned that, I did find it noteworthy at the beginning of the story that all of the comparisons that Andersen initially makes to his romantic feelings toward Edvard, he uses opposite gendered pronouns. Like, in order for him to convey that his feelings are romantic toward Edvard, he has to compare his feelings to those which he might exhibit toward women because he's a man. I'm sure his word choice is a product of the times from which this story comes, though.
That's a very interesting observation. And even today, there is dominance of heterosexual love in society and media because it is the default setting. However, I think it's really important that we address this man and woman angle, because if we change the story and make it between a man and a woman, I don't think we'll use aggressive and repressive, but instead, Edvard would be coy and shy, and Andersen would be a passionate and dominant lover, pursuing and courting his lady, and this kind of behavior would be expected from him and considered romantic. Even now, men are expected to take the lead in pursuing women by asking them out, paying on dates, and eventually going on one knee to propose. We talk about equality, but there are certain gendered expectations we aren't yet comfortable to let go. But since this is a story about two men, the same behavior isn't looked from a romanticized angle.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And so for our story, that means that the situation where that Andersen is a man but Edvard is a woman, the story could have still ended the same, and Edvard could have been ignoring Andersen's letters because, you know, either Edward wanted to be with Andersen but just couldn't due to other circumstances, or didn't want to be with Andersen. So yeah, so I agree that despite the gender of the two people, the story could have still ended the same way, and yet we use different terms to describe the characters because it is a story between two men, and because society back then and to some extent now requires two men who might have feelings for one another to repress those feelings or hide those feelings or ignore those feelings. And I don't want to get too far away from what the points that you were making, but I think the story highlights how accepting Andersen was of himself, maybe, or maybe his feelings were just so strong that he wasn't scared of society and what society might say. And you know, this might also be going on a tangent, but Edward might also be acting the way that he is because, you know, I'm not sure in the 1800s, wherever they were, if same-sex relationships were even legal. Maybe Edward was just scared, and maybe Andersen just didn't care. And so I feel like I've gotten really far away from the point that you were trying to make, but those are just some more thoughts that came into my head as I was thinking about what you were saying.
Yeah, I don't think they were legal anywhere in 1800s, but probably I might be wrong. But I think I put my money on that they were not legal anywhere in 1800s. They are still not legal everywhere, which is tragic. So yeah, your point could be very well be valid that he was just scared to come out and embrace that lifestyle.
So since we were comparing it to maybe a love story between a man and a woman, and you were bringing up all of the societal expectations, another thought popped into my head. What you were saying was about society might expect men to be the dominant person in the relationship and for women to follow. And so if Andersen's telling Edward that his feelings for him are romantic, then maybe Edward thinks that Andersen is thinking of him as a woman or as someone who needs to submit in the relationship. And Edward might have feelings for Andersen but not want to act on them, not necessarily because society looks down upon it, but also because of the way Andersen's acting in the first instance. I don't know how that likely that is, but it's just a thought.
Right. Yeah, no, I think my point was just that the same story between a man and a woman would be looked from a different lens, and that lens probably would have a more positive light to it.
Yeah.
That was the bottom line of my soapbox.
Right, but you know, you did make a good point while you were on your soapbox that even today society expects men to lead and women to follow. And so that society definitely expected that in the 1800s.
Yeah. All these points are possibilities and are speculations, but I do think it was an unhealthy relationship. Be it friendship or romantic, one person was way more invested, and this does happen in relationships. People are invested in varying degrees, and if that variation is big, someone ends up getting hurt.
Yeah, that's a good point. There are so many relationships out there that are one-sided, where one person is putting their heart on their sleeve and the other person, for whatever reason, is just kind of being dismissive of that. And that could be the case here. I think that it's interesting that Edward finally tells Andersen that he's a worthy friend. It's almost like he's telling Andersen to stop writing him, because I think at this point Edward knows Andersen and he knows what to say to get Andersen to react a certain way. It finally clicked in Andersen's head. Edward doesn't feel the same way as me, as I feel for him, and that's because he called me just a friend.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he has moved on. He has a fiance now, and he is friend-zoning Andersen. And probably the oldest example of friend-zoning we have in the history.
Maybe.
Right? I think it was kind of interesting, the whole dynamics. And we can't really say anything because we don't know what really happened in that time. And we can just speculate. Mm-hmm. And not to say that it is a totally different world now. I mean, it is, but still, anything outside a heterosexual, cis-gendered relationship is so much more complicated. It just comes with so much, I would say, baggage. There is so much more need to be done for society to be completely accepting and equal for everyone, no matter how they want to express their feelings or their relationships.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that obviously since the 1800s, society has evolved, and that includes society's viewpoint towards same-sex relationships and toward the idea that gender is fluid and is not fixed to one's biological sex. But there's still so much more that needs to be done. Society still isn't perfect. It's still hard for people.
At this point, I want to bring in another topic to our discussion, and that is the Pride Month. But before we discuss, a brief history real quick. Origin of Pride Month brings us to the Stonewall riots in 1969 in New York City. Fed up with being harassed and targeted, the queer patrons of the Stonewall Inn, who were predominantly people of color, fought back against the police. It resulted in 4 nights of rioting. Before Stonewall, queer leaders had primarily promoted silent vigils and polite pickets, such as Annual Reminder in Philadelphia. Since 1965, a small, polite group of gays and lesbians had been picketing outside Liberty Hall. The walk would occur in silence. Required dress for men was jacket and ties, for women only dresses, because they were supposed to be unthreatening. Stonewall, spurred by the frustration of being targeted and harassed, worked where polite and civil protests had failed. The first Pride March took place in 1970, a year later, to commemorate, loudly and without a dress code, those who fought for their rights. Thanks to those Stonewall patrons and generations of queer people who fought for the rights of the community, the world is now an easier place to live for queer people than it was. Since then, June is Pride Month, involving a variety of events, including activism, parades, and concerts. But obviously, where there is celebration, the vulture's gonna come flying in. And what I mean by vultures is the corporations and brands getting involved. Hashtag rainbow capitalism.
Yeah, Pride celebrations were originally a strongly political act, born of a time when tolerance still hadn't been won, with the goal to make the world a better place where LGBTQ people don't need to fight for rights. But over time, it's become more about the party, in part because of progress that has been made, than the politics. And it's a hell of a lot easier to make money from a party than it is a political act.
And it is great that queer people are partying, celebrating, and being celebrated. We are not scrutinizing how you participate in Pride Month and activities. My issue is with the commercialization. Today, the queer movement is increasingly being used for political and economic purposes. The achievement of symbolic rights for the community is used to justify profiting off celebrations of sexual identity. Many companies might market rainbow-colored merchandise, but not always be consistent in actually supporting the queer community. They contribute an extremely small percentage of their rainbow merchandise sales to the queer charities, showing how the campaign served as nothing more than a marketing tactic masquerading itself as activism and expanding their market demographic. Corporations announce countless rainbow-colored products every year while investing in private prisons, slave labor, funding homophobic politicians and lawmakers, and ignoring the higher rate of queer people suffering from substance abuse, homelessness, and discrimination.
For brands to actually be good allies, allyship must extend beyond the month of June, Pride Month, and be incorporated into their business models. This might include hiring queer employees, partnering with reputable queer organizations, and actually making sizable donations to queer charities. And obviously not giving money to politicians who have a history of making anti-queer bills and laws. Speaking of which, there were more than 250 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced in state legislatures from across the country in 2021 so far, and additional bills may be filed before the end of their legislative sessions. Of these, 8 have already been enacted into law, including anti-trans medical care ban bill in Arkansas, a religious refusals bill in North Dakota, South Dakota, and in Arkansas, and another 10 are already on governors' desks awaiting signatures.
That's insane. Even though queerness is more acceptable today socially, it is nowhere near equality. Just like the Little Mermaid from the story, if not all, but some still are walking in a society with every step being pricked by sharp knives.
Wow, I think this was a great full circle back to the story.
Yes, and as a parting thought, I want to add that these large corporations have the ability, power, and platform to shift power structures and transform the landscape in which they operate. Corporate involvement in queer issues can be a powerful tool for society if done right. But it is ultimately up to consumers to hold brands accountable and ensure they create inclusive environments not just in June but every month of the year. Make sure if you buy any rainbow merchandise, check what other things the company supports and funds, because it is your money that is supporting the cause, whatever that may be.
Yeah, and it's so important to promote lesser known grassroots movements and getting local organizations to participate in real activism. While well-funded nationwide organizations are important and effective, queer communities strongly benefit from the efforts of local movements, simply because they are the most immediate sources of change. And any donations go directly toward helping those in need. Additionally, many grassroots movements are organized and led by queer people of color. Thus, the queer community is allowed to take control of their own success and well-being. So if you, the consumer, buy wisely, your participation can heed great results. But if you really want to make a difference, donate your time or money to grassroots organizations in your area. Chances are that they could really use the help and will use it well.
Preach! Dylan, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts and knowledge with me and everyone listening.
Thanks for having me, Vipul, and I hope you have me on again soon.
Yes, you will, next week, where we do a deeper dive in The Little Mermaid in the part 2 of this episode.
Sounds good. Can't wait.
So, no bye for now. To be continued. Let me know your thoughts on the story and our discussion by emailing me on WokeTalesPodcast@gmail.com or through social media at WokeTalesPodcast on Instagram and WokeTalesPod on Twitter. And please rate, review, and like WokeTales Podcast, and don't forget to subscribe so you can easily access our weekly stories. If you have any story recommendations, or if you want to come dissect and analyze a story with me, give me a shout out on email or social media. Because whatever you do, keep dissecting and keep analyzing.